You wake up to the sound of stone grinding against stone, a steady scraping that echoes through limestone passageways, which have been silent for more than 3,000 years. Your palms press against the cold sandstone as you stand, and in that instant, you realize where you are, deep inside a pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The walls around you are covered with the hieroglyphs that seem alive in the flickering torchlight. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh, mixed with something older and unsettling, making your stomach twist. As your eyes adjust, you notice the carvings more clearly. Every surface is filled with scenes, intimate, shocking, and unlike anything you were ever taught in school. Archaeologists debated for decades whether some of these images should even be photographed. These aren't the clean, idealized depictions of Egyptian love you might expect. They tell stories that are raw, sacred, and deeply tied to ritual. Tales of sacred prostitution, ceremonial unions, and sexual practices so closely linked with religion that they shaped Egyptian society for more than 2,000 years. Before we step deeper into these forgotten accounts of survival and suffering, let me pause. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden sides of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It amazes me that people all over the world are exploring these stories together. Now, walk with me further into this tomb, because what you're about to learn may completely change how you see one of the most fascinating civilizations in history. In 1323 BC, a 14-year-old girl named Ankhesenamun stood trembling inside the antechamber of Karnak Temple. Her linen dress was so sheer it barely covered her, and her gold jewelry rattled softly as she shook, not from cold, but from dread of what was coming. She was the daughter of the so-called heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and the widow of the boy king Tutankhamun. On that day, she was about to take part in one of Egypt's most sacred and most disturbing rituals, the divine marriage ceremony of the Opet festival. From the shadows appeared the high priest. His head was shaved and glistening with sacred oils, but his eyes revealed a hunger that had nothing to do with worship. In just moments, Ankhesenamun would be expected to consummate a union with the god Amun-Ra, or rather, with the priest acting as the god's earthly vessel. This was not symbolic. It was literal. Egypt's most powerful religious leaders claimed royal women under divine authority, and it happened again and again throughout pharaonic history. Evidence from Deir el-Medina, discovered by archaeologist Bernard Bruyère in 1922, shows that this practice was not reserved for queens. Papyrus records reveal that hundreds of girls, some as young as 12, were given the title God's wives. Behind the sacred name was the reality of ritualized sexual slavery. The selection process for these girls was harsh. Priests inspected them unclothed, searching for the slightest imperfection, a scar, a crooked tooth, even uneven breasts, anything that might offend the gods. Ironically, those rejected for flaws may have been the lucky ones, spared years of ritual exploitation. Research by Dr. Joyce Tildesley of Manchester University uncovered temple records from Thebes dating back to 1550 BC that describe the daily lives of these women. They lived inside temple compounds, wore clothing that set them apart, and were forbidden to marry or have children outside of their duties. If they did become pregnant through temple rituals, their children were often handed over to the temples trapping families in generations of religious servitude. What made these unions even more unsettling was that they were not private. During major festivals, such as Opet or Sed, thousands of Egyptians gathered to watch as pharaohs or priests enacted these divine marriages in public ceremonies. The crowds believed that the sexual union of a woman and a god would bring the Nile's floods, ensure fertile harvests, and guarantee prosperity for the kingdom. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, described his shock at these events. He recalled watching young noblewomen being prepared for ritual unions and noted their visible distress, which the Egyptians misread as spiritual ecstasy. Archaeological evidence at the Temple of Min in Coptos shows carvings of these unions in graphic detail. The god Min is depicted with an erect phallus, engaging with women whose faces are turned away, possibly a way to show reluctance or shame. Surrounding these scenes are musicians, dancers, and offerings, creating a festival atmosphere around what was essentially ritualized assault. Papyrus fragments from the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus also reveal treatments for women who showed signs of what we now recognize as trauma: loss of appetite, sleeplessness, sudden crying, and withdrawal from society. Even in antiquity, the emotional toll of these practices was recorded. Society, however, accepted it. Marriage contracts from the New Kingdom, 1550, 1070 BC, often released husbands from obligations if their wives were summoned to temple service. Fathers even calculated bride prices based on whether their daughters had already served in temples. Girls who were valued less, despite their supposed divine blessing. But the disturbing story of Egypt's rituals does not end with the living. In 945 BC, embalmers prepared the body of a young noblewoman who had died in childbirth. Her grieving family never knew what took place inside the embalming chamber because the secrets of mummification were guarded more closely than any royal treasure. Modern CT scans, carried out in 2005 by Dr. Zahi Hawass and his team at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, revealed something shocking. About 23% of female mummies showed signs of sexual violation after death, but before being wrapped. The practice was hinted at long ago by Herodotus, who wrote in 440 BC that families often delayed delivering the bodies of beautiful women to embalmers to protect them. He mentioned one embalmer who was executed by his colleagues, not for committing the act, but for being caught. Further evidence comes from papyri found at Deir el-Bahri in 1881, which include what look like embalmer training texts. They describe purification rituals that required opening all sacred passages of a woman's body, disturbing words that suggest ritualized sexual abuse of corpses during preparation for burial. At first, modern scholars thought these texts described routine evisceration during embalming, but when studied more closely, the precise anatomical terms and ritual context pointed to something much darker. The mummification process lasted 70 days, during which bodies remained in embalming workshops with little supervision from families or religious officials. Records from Tanis, dated around 1000 BC, show that embalmers often worked alone during night shifts. Egyptians believed the dead were most vulnerable to spirits at night, and this belief gave embalmers both the privacy and opportunity to commit acts that would never be detected. Evidence of such abuse comes not only from modern CT scans, but also from ancient sources that tried to confront the issue. The Harris Papyrus, now housed in the British Museum, contains legal records from 156 BC describing trials of embalmers accused of defiling the sacred vessels. Scholars now understand this phrase as a euphemism for sexual abuse of corpses. Punishments were severe. Convicted embalmers were executed, their families stripped of wealth and banished from their communities. The most unsettling aspect was that these acts were not random. They were ritualized. Some embalmers believed that sexual contact with the dead transferred the woman's life force to them, granting greater virility or even longer life. Amulets found in embalming workshops show sexual imagery involving mummies, and several papyri contain spells meant to be recited during these acts. In their minds, necrophilia was treated as a magical practice, not merely an act of violation. One of the most chilling cases comes from the mummy of Princess Meketaten, daughter of Queen Nefertiti, who died around 1330 BC at the age of 13. For years, damage to her wrappings was blamed on tomb robbers, but forensic analysis revealed deliberate unwrapping and rewrapping in the pelvic region, along with resin residue between layers. Clear signs her body was accessed repeatedly during mummification. Centuries later, Coptic Christian writers expressed horror at these practices. In 385 AD, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria condemned the defilement of female corpses, accusing embalmers of abusing women in the name of Egypt's gods of death. His writings suggest that such practices lingered well into the Roman period, so notorious that many Christian families refused mummification altogether. The toll on embalmers themselves was striking. Records from Memphis show unusually high suicide rates among men working in embalming complexes. Many drowned themselves in the Nile, a death believed to prevent the soul from reaching the afterlife. Some scholars argue this may have been an act of guilt-driven self-punishment by men unable to confess their crimes without facing execution. Perhaps the darkest evidence suggests that women were sometimes killed specifically to provide fresh bodies. A young woman discovered in the Saqqara necropolis showed signs of deliberate poisoning with oleander, a toxin that kills swiftly while preserving the body. Papyrus fragments found with her wrappings contained prayers begging forgiveness from Osiris, suggesting the embalmer knew she had been murdered for this purpose. Meanwhile, inside Malkata Palace, in 1358 BC, Princess Sitamun pressed her forehead against a cool limestone wall, listening as her father's footsteps echoed closer. At just 23 years old, she had already borne her father, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, a daughter, an innocent child who played in the palace gardens, unaware her grandfather was also her father. Tonight, like many nights before, Sitamun would fulfill her role as both daughter and wife, continuing the cycle of incest that shaped Egypt's royal family for more than 1,000 years. Royal incest in Egypt was not an occasional scandal. It was deliberate, systematic, and thoroughly documented. In 2010, DNA analysis of royal mummies in the Cairo Museum, led by geneticist Dr. Karsten Pusch, revealed the extent of inbreeding. Tutankhamun himself was the child of a brother-sister union, and suffered from multiple congenital disorders, spina bifida, clubfoot, and temporal lobe epilepsy, all linked to generations of incest. This tradition began as early as 3100 BC, but it reached its peak during the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1295 BC. Thutmose I married his sister Amos. Their son, Thutmose II, married his half-sister Hatshepsut, and the pattern continued relentlessly. Marriage, contracts from this period, preserved on papyrus in the Metropolitan Museum, even distinguished between sisters of the body, full sisters, and sisters of the house, half-sisters, with inheritance rights carefully divided according to the degree of incest. But sibling marriage was only part of the story. Amenhotep II married 3 of his own daughters. Records from Amarna reveal that Akhenaten had sexual relationships with at least 6 of his daughters at once. One limestone relief shows him kissing one daughter while another sits on his lap, with inscriptions openly calling both wives and daughters of his body. The cost to royal women was devastating. Many died young under mysterious circumstances. Queen Ankhesenamun, both daughter and wife of Akhenaten and later wife of Tutankhamun, lived to 27, an unusually long life for an Egyptian royal woman. Her mummy, examined in 2010, shows signs of depression, vitamin D deficiency from being kept indoors, stress fractures from physical abuse, and repeated pregnancies ending in miscarriage or infant death. Medical papyri from the Edwin Smith collection describe treatments for conditions we now know are caused by incest. Instructions for splints and exercises to treat children born twisted suggest that deformities were common in the royal line. One disturbing text even describes a surgery for infants born with sealed passages, likely a reference to genital malformations caused by severe inbreeding. The most chilling proof came from the royal mummy cache, uncovered in 1881 at Deir el-Bahari. Of the 11 royal mummies found, DNA testing showed that 9 were children of incestuous unions, and 7 displayed genetic disorders. Inside Tutankhamun's own tomb, 2 tiny mummies were discovered, his stillborn daughters, both born from his marriage to his half-sister Ankhesenamun. Forensic evidence confirmed both suffered fatal neural tube defects. Palace politics often revolved around which daughters would be chosen for royal marriage. The Amarna letters, diplomatic exchanges between Egypt and neighboring states, show foreign kings expressing shock at these customs. Around 1350 BC, the king of Mitanni wrote to Amenhotep III, "Your daughters who are wives are many, yet you have not sent me one of your daughters in marriage. Why is this? Your daughters are your wives, and your wives are your daughters. My scribes cannot even record this without confusion." Records also tell us that many royal women tried to flee their fate. Several papyri describe princesses escaping to neighboring kingdoms, only to be captured and dragged back by Egyptian soldiers. One record from 1345 BC describes Princess Bakatana desperately seeking asylum with the Hittites. In her letter to their king, she pleaded, "My father wishes to make me his wife, just as he did with my sisters, but I would rather die in a foreign land than submit to such a violation of nature's law." This disturbing custom created a twisted palace culture where normal family ties became impossible. Royal children grew up unsure if their mothers were really their sisters or their aunts, and whether their brothers were, in fact, their fathers or their uncles. Palace documents from the reign of Ramses II describe a complicated system of titles and court etiquette that existed only to manage these confusing family roles. Specific rules even dictated how to address relatives who held more than one position within the family. Religion was used to justify incest. Pharaohs compared themselves to the gods Isis and Osiris, who were siblings but also married. Temple carvings show royal couples offering sacrifices, while inscriptions emphasized their brother-sister relationship as a divine blessing. Yet outside the palace, many Egyptians found the practice repulsive. Private papyri from noble households show their disgust. One nobleman wrote to his son around 1330 BC, "The royal house breeds like animals in their dens, sister with brother, father with daughter. That is why the gods curse their children with twisted limbs and early death." The consequences were severe. Genetic problems grew worse with each generation. By the end of the 18th dynasty, over 60% of royal infants died at birth. Many of the survivors lived with physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and short lives. The mummy of Tutankhamun reveals just how destructive this inbreeding was. He suffered chronic pain, could barely walk without help, and died at age 19. Genetic studies strongly suggest his illnesses and deformities were a direct result of inbreeding. Inside the Temple of Hathor, at Dendera, oil lamps flickered as 12-year-old Nefertari lay on a cold stone altar, her hands gripping its carved edges until her knuckles turned white. She was about to endure one of ancient Egypt's most brutal religious practices, the ritual of defloration, carried out by priests who claimed to be opening a sacred gateway for the gods. Dozens of officials stood ready to witness the event. Scribes would record every detail, and the community would celebrate her violation as a blessing from the divine. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Mut at Karnak confirms these rituals were common. Stone tablets from 1400 to 1200 BC list more than 300 such ceremonies, including the names of the girls, their ages, and the priests who carried them out. The youngest victim was only 9 years old. The oldest was 16. Most were between 12 and 14, barely past puberty in a society where childhood ended brutally early. The process began with 3 days of purification. Selected girls were bathed in sacred pools, anointed with oils, mixed with frankincense and myrrh, and given special foods meant to make them spiritually receptive. During this time, they were forbidden to speak to anyone except the temple priestesses who instructed them. The priestesses warned the girls that showing fear or resistance would anger the gods. Papyrus fragments from the Ramesseum describe the religious reasoning. Priests believed virginity held sacred power, which could only be released through ritual defloration performed by purified men. The act itself was considered a sacrifice, the girl's blood and suffering offered to the gods for the community's benefit. Temple manuals from Edfu outline the strict procedures. The girl was brought before the crowd in a thin linen gown and gold jewelry, marked as an offering. Incense burned, while musicians played hymns to fertility gods. Then the high priest, acting in the name of the deity, deflowered her, using ritual objects preserved as sacred relics, knives, stone phalluses, or carved wooden instruments believed to channel divine power. Research by Dr. Joanne Fletcher found physical evidence of this brutality. Remains of young girls unearthed at Abydos show pelvic injuries, consistent with violent assault, along with signs of infection. Some even died from internal bleeding. Carbon dating proves such practices lasted for more than 500 years. The emotional damage these girls suffered was ignored or twisted into proof of divine favor. Girls who became mute, withdrawn, or self-destructive were said to be touched by the gods and were forced into permanent temple service. Ancient medical papyri describe treatments for divine madness in young women, including herbal remedies for sleeplessness, violent behavior, and refusal to eat. What we now recognize as trauma from sexual abuse. Some temples even built hierarchies around the ritual. The Chester Beatty Papyrus VI lists administrative roles, including a priest titled Opener of the Sacred Gateway. This position gave privileges such as larger food rations, better housing, and the right to choose which girls to deflower. These posts often passed from father to son, creating entire dynasties of ritual abusers. Accounts also show regional variations. In Lower Egypt, ceremonies often took place during the Nile's flooding, symbolically linking the girl's blood to the river's life-giving waters. In Upper Egypt, they were tied to harvest festivals, where the girl's violation was believed to ensure fertility for crops and animals. The most horrifying records come from the Temple of Min at Coptos, where annual festivals involved mass deflorations. Dozens of girls were assaulted in one event. The Greek writer Strabo, visiting in 25 BC, described his shock at seeing children defiled, while crowds cheered and threw flowers. He noted that some girls died from shock or blood loss, and yet their deaths were praised as signs of divine approval. Economic records show that families were sometimes compensated for offering their daughters, but the payments only came after the rituals were complete. Temple records from Thebes reveal that families who tried to withdraw their daughters faced brutal punishments, loss of land, forced labor, or exile. Still, some people resisted. Papyri from private collections reveal coded warnings used to help families escape temple scouts. One text from 1250 BC reads, "When the lotus seekers come to your door, remember that the river runs deep, but it also runs away." Scholars believe this was a reference to secret escape routes for families trying to protect their daughters. Centuries later, in 570 BC, the Temple of Bastet at Bubastis glowed with hundreds of oil lamps. Shadows flickered across walls decorated with cats, dancers, and ritual scenes. The city prepared for one of Egypt's most infamous festivals, a 3-day celebration in which ordinary women became sacred prostitutes, offering themselves to strangers in honor of the cat goddess. Even for seasoned ancient historians, what took place at these festivals was almost beyond belief. Yet this festival of Bastet was only one part of a vast system of religious prostitution that existed across Egypt for more than 2,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, claimed to have personally witnessed these rituals. He described how, once a year, women from the region gathered at the Temple of Bastet. For 3 days, they offered themselves to any man who brought the proper payment to the goddess. No woman was allowed to refuse any man, whether Egyptian, Greek, Nubian, or Persian. The payment went directly to the temple, and the sexual act was considered the most sacred duty a woman could perform. Excavations at Bubastis carried out by Edward Naville between 1887 and 1889, uncovered striking evidence of these prostitution festivals. Beneath the temple floors, archaeologists found thousands of small pottery tokens. Each bore the image of Bastet on one side and sexually explicit images on the other. Carbon dating placed them between 800 and 200 BC, showing that they were used as receipts for payment during the festivals. The sheer scale was staggering. Over 12,000 tokens were found in a single site, pointing to thousands of women and men participating over just a few days. But sacred prostitution in Egypt was not limited to annual festivals. Records from Philae, uncovered during the Aswan High Dam rescue excavations in the 1960s, describe a permanent class of sacred prostitutes known as the God's Wives of Amun. These women lived in special temple quarters, wore distinctive clothing that advertised their role, and provided sexual services to male visitors year-round under strict religious rules. Papyri discovered at Tebtunis in 1899 provide a haunting look into their daily lives. In one letter, written around 200 BC, a prostitute confided to her sister, "I have served 37 men this month, and still the goddess demands more. My body aches, but worse is my heart, which grows harder each day, like stone in the sun. I pray to Bastet to release me, but she remains silent." Economically, sacred prostitution became a cornerstone of temple revenue. Account books from the Temple of Sobek at Crocodilopolis record prostitution payments alongside offerings of grain, livestock, and gold. During major festivals, prostitution income surpassed all other sources of temple wealth. This dependency created strong incentives to expand the system, regardless of the human suffering it caused. Recruitment often resembled human trafficking. Poor families were approached by temple officials who promised food, shelter, and spiritual rewards if they gave their daughters as servants of the goddess. Once inside the temple, girls rarely left. Legal records from Oxyrhynchus document families trying to reclaim their daughters, only to be told the girls had sworn sacred vows that could never be broken without angering the gods. Medical papyri from the Kahun archive reveal how common disease and injury were among sacred prostitutes. Treatments for temple sickness, likely sexually transmitted infections, appear repeatedly, along with recipes for contraception, abortion herbs, and ointments for genital injuries. One especially grim text describes surgical repairs for internal damage caused by violent clients, showing that abuse was widespread. The age of initiation dropped sharply during famines or wars. Temple censuses, such as the Wilbur Papyrus from 141 BC, list dozens of girls under 14, some as young as 10 or 11, serving male clients before reaching womanhood. Greek and Roman visitors noted regional variations. In Memphis, prostitution took place in hidden underground chambers equipped with ventilation and soundproofing, suggesting deliberate secrecy. At Elephantine, sex was performed in temple gardens, sometimes in full view of worshippers making offerings. The psychological control of these women was built on indoctrination from childhood. Girls were taught that serving strangers sexually was the highest form of worship, that their bodies were divine vessels, and that unhappiness showed spiritual weakness. Confession texts found in temples contained desperate prayers, women begging forgiveness for feeling revulsion, fear, or the wish to escape. Some left behind personal marks of resistance. At Edfu, graffiti carved by sacred prostitutes survive. One message from 156 BC reads, "Isis knows the pain in my heart, but I cannot speak it aloud. May other daughters be spared this blessing." Another says simply, "I have forgotten my name, but the goddess remembers my body." This system created endless legal and social problems. Court records from Thebes describe men suing temples after contracting diseases from sacred prostitutes. Other disputes centered on children born from these encounters, who their fathers were, whether they inherited property, and whether they belonged to their mothers or to the temples. Meanwhile, in 1279 BC, at a workshop near the Valley of the Kings, the embalmer User Hatmos prepared the body of a noble woman named Merita for burial. But this mummification was not just about preserving organs. Religious texts carved into tombs instructed that women must retain their sexual organs intact, for in the afterlife they would be expected to serve gods, spirits, and even pharaohs sexually for eternity. The pyramid texts, dating back to 2400 BC, are among Egypt's oldest religious writings and speak openly of sex in the afterlife. Dead kings were promised women to satisfy all their desires, while female spirits were described as existing mainly for male pleasure. One passage, Pyramid Text 690, states, "The king will possess the wives of the gods, and they will satisfy his desires as they satisfied the desires of their divine husbands when they lived." Archaeological evidence supports this. In the Valley of the Queens, women were buried with sexual objects for use in the afterlife. Excavations by Dr. Joanne Fletcher at Tomb QV55, believed to belong to a daughter of Ramses II, uncovered a set of phallic objects made from wood, ivory, and stone, tools intended to ensure her sexual readiness in eternity. Archaeologists have uncovered objects carefully wrapped in linen and placed between the legs of female mummies. These were positioned so the spirit of the deceased could access them in the afterlife. Dozens of female tombs from the New Kingdom contain similar items. Unlike men, women were prepared with special procedures during mummification, all aimed at preserving sexual function for eternity. Papyrus records from workshops at Thebes describe how embalmers inserted resin-soaked linen into the vaginal canal of female corpses. Officially, this was said to prevent tissues from collapsing, yet the placement and materials used strongly suggest the real purpose was to maintain the shape and accessibility of sexual organs, not simply to preserve them. Tomb art confirms this. Burial chambers of high-ranking officials show explicit scenes of the dead continuing sexual acts with female servants who were buried with them. In the tomb of Vizier Remteti, 10100, dated to 1450 BC, paintings show the official having intercourse with women labeled as his eternal servants, while others prepare food and entertainment. These images were not decorative. They were instructions for what was expected to continue in the afterlife. The sacrifice of women for this purpose was common in Egypt's early dynastic era and persisted in different forms for centuries. Remains from secondary graves beside major tombs reveal women killed by strangulation, poisoning, or even live burial. Pharaoh Djer's tomb at Abydos, around 3000 BC, held 338 sacrificed attendants. Forensic study shows that 127 were young women with no signs of natural death. Religious texts reinforce these beliefs. In private tombs, writings described women's eternal sexual duties. Chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, the famous negative confession, included statements where women promised to serve the desires of righteous men and open themselves to those who had divine favor. These passages show clearly that women's afterlife roles were not rewards for virtue, but punishments tied to their supposedly sinful nature. Examination of mummies also reveals shocking evidence. Some female corpses were posed in sexual positions after death. The mummy of Queen Henutawi, wife of High Priest Pinigem the Phmeris, was found with her legs repositioned and held apart during wrapping. Similar treatment appears in many female mummies of the 21st dynasty, suggesting this was a routine practice to ensure sexual access even after death. The tomb of Pharaoh Seti contains one of the most disturbing discoveries. Hidden chambers, uncovered in 1960, feature graphic wall paintings of the pharaoh having sex with goddesses and mortal women. Inscriptions describe these women as eternal concubines, destined to satisfy him endlessly without rest or refusal. Other tombs contained sexual burial goods. In the tomb of Yuya and Tuyu, parents of Queen Tiye, archaeologists found objects once thought to be religious tools. Modern analysis revealed them as intricately carved sex toys made of ebony and ivory, wrapped in fine linen and placed in cedar boxes with prayers for their effectiveness in the afterlife. Medical papyri also reflect these practices. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus included instructions to prevent facial disfigurement in female mummies, warning that ugliness repels the desire of gods and men, even in death. These elaborate procedures cost far more than standard embalming and created a profitable niche for embalmers who offered to keep wealthy women desirable for eternity. Greek and Roman visitors were horrified by what they witnessed. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in 50 BC, described his shock at how Egyptian women were prepared for death as if they were brides, with special attention to their sexual organs to ensure they could please men beyond the grave. He reported seeing women's corpses arranged and dressed like courtesans awaiting clients. The psychological effect on living women was profound. Personal letters and diary fragments show their dread. One woman, writing to her sister around 1200 BC, confessed, "I fear death, not for dying itself, but for the eternal servitude that awaits. In life I may choose my husband, but in death I must serve any spirit who desires me." Another, found in a tomb at Saqqara, begged the gods to let her die before her beauty faded, hoping that ugliness might spare her from the sexual demands in the afterlife. Sacred festivals added to this culture. Around temple lakes, torchlight ceremonies drew thousands, where acts considered criminal in daylight became sacred rituals. Aristocratic women, temple prostitutes, and enslaved captives were forced into ritualized sexual violence, all believed to win divine favor. Children born from these encounters were raised as temple property, continuing cycles of abuse for generations. Even marriage contracts reflected this mindset, often including clauses freeing husbands of obligations if their wives were called for temple service. Fathers calculated dowries based on whether daughters had already served in temples. Medical texts treated trauma from ritual rape not as harm, but as divine madness that required gratitude rather than healing. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, Octavian immediately banned temple prostitution and ritual sexual ceremonies. Centuries later, Christian missionaries found temples abandoned, but still covered in explicit carvings that locals were too ashamed to explain to their children. Today, as we walk through those tombs and study their carvings, the truth emerges. Ancient Egypt, a land of beauty and grandeur, also normalized sexual violence in the name of religion. Its people believed suffering, especially of women, was the price of divine favor. These practices remind us that throughout history, the most terrible acts often hid behind the mask of the sacred. The walls of those tombs still whisper their warnings, etched forever in stone, in blood, and in tears.